Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you folks for joining us on United for Efficiency's webinar on accelerating the switch to climate-friendly refrigerating appliances and ACs using the new model regulation guidelines. My name is Brian Holly. I lead the cooling activities for United for Efficiency here at UN Environment, and delighted to have you joining us here today on this webinar. It's part of a series of outreach activities that we've been doing on these new resources. And this is meant to be interactive. We're going to go through a series of slides here over the first 45 minutes or so. And after that, we'll be opening it up for questions, for a question and answer session with the attendees. So all you'd have to do is go on to the questions aspect of the side panel, the control panel, under the right side of your screen, and you can submit a question, and we will collect those and during the Q&A session try and get through as many as possible. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. As far as speakers for today's lineup, we're going to kick off with Dr. Gabrielle Dreyfus once I finish these opening remarks. Dr. Dreyfus is with the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, a philanthropic organization that's been critical to underpinning this work that we've undertaken. And she will frame up some of the big picture perspectives on climate, energy, the real impacts that are possible through the model regulation guidelines. Okay, so again, I'm Brian Holly with UNEP's United for Efficiency initiative, and I'm really going to dive into why we undertook this activity over the past year, how we went about it, and now that we have these resources ready, we're going to share with folks our plans for deploying the model regulation guidelines. Once I wrap up, we're going to hear from both Alex Hilbrand from Natural Resources Defense Council and Dr. Neehoff Shah from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and they're really going to get into the more technical aspects. What is the content? Why did we make some of the decisions we did regarding the content? And some of what they will be drawing from is something called a supporting information document. So this is what underpins the rationale, the levels that we selected, so on and so forth. So they'll really take you through the contents of the model regulation guidelines. And then after that, we'll go ahead and do the Q&A with the audience. So with that, oh, I jumped too quickly. With that, I'm going to ask that Gabby Dreyfus from Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program go ahead and share some opening perspectives for us. Gabby, over to you.
Thanks, Brian, and welcome everyone to this webinar on a really important topic with model regulations. And I want to put things in perspective. So I don't know if I have control over the slides, Brian. Should I go to the next slide?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and advance you from this end.
Okay. So the context, as most folks are aware, is that we are living in a warming world. And not only is the world warming, but it's warming at an accelerating rate. The Earth has warmed approximately 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. And if warming continues at the present pace, global average temperatures could potentially reach 1.5 C above pre-industrial as soon as 2030. And even earlier, potentially, if we take into account some of the accelerating warming, for example, in the Arctic regions. So this is why it's very important to identify where we have mitigation strategies that can be fast acting and where we have the tools to make them real. Next slide, please. The good news is that we have the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer that has, since its existence, it was agreed in '87, has avoided approximately as much radiative forcing to date as current forcing from CO2. It's about 1.7 watts per meter squared. Now, the Kigali Amendment, which was agreed in 2016 and went into effect in January of 2019, is estimated to avoid approximately 0.4 Celsius of warming by the 21st century. And the scientific assessment panel of the Montreal Protocol found that the improvements, if we were also to improve the energy efficiency of cooling equipment, we could potentially double the climate emissions benefits from the HFC phase down in the near term. An analysis recently completed by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, for example, just looking at the energy-related emissions, if we were to to essentially replace stationary air conditioning and refrigeration with best available technologies today, could avoid cumulative emissions of 150 to 280 gigatons of CO2 by 2060. So this is one of the largest mitigation sectors available to us. Next slide, please. Just a quick word on the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. It's a philanthropic collaboration that is focused on promoting energy efficiency of cooling to increase and accelerate the climate and development benefits alongside the Kigali Amendment and the Montreal Protocol refrigerant transitions. The focus of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program is on mitigation, but we also are concerned about health and equity through our access to cooling window. And I encourage everyone to look up the Sustainable Energy for All cooling outlook that was just released earlier this month. So we built partnerships across the Montreal Protocol and energy efficiency spaces, including work with the Montreal Protocol institutions, and the work with UN Environment and U4E has been very important as we look to provide tools and knowledge to help with strengthening energy efficiency policies, standards, and programs. Next slide, please. One of the things that has been very revealing as we've looked at the cooling sector, in particular, the largest in terms of units, the Minisplit Market for air conditioners, we see that there is a strong relationship between policies for efficiency and not only the level of efficiency of equipment, but also the refrigerants that are being used. So we just very bluntly, the absence of good efficiency policies is affecting markets and consumers directly. So the figure that you see here shows aggregated at high, different regional levels using data from Japan's AC Industry Association and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We see that there's a strong correlation between markets dominated by higher efficiency products, which are generally variable speed or inverter-driven ACs, and the share of HFC refrigerant, and conversely, where there are the highest percentage of fixed speed, which tend to be less efficient, although there are regions where they are very efficient, for example, in the Middle East, where they run more often. But we saw, for example, when we did an inventory of AC compressors, that we found no inverter ACs that used R22 or the other way around. There are no, so all the 22, all 22s were fixed speed compressors, which generally are less efficient. Next slide, please. So here you see aggregated the savings that are calculated by the U4E projects, the country assessments. I highly recommend taking a look at these. They're at the country level. Here they're aggregated by region and color coded. These are the savings on the left for electricity. You have air conditioners on the top and refrigerating appliances on the bottom. But from left to right, just in terms of the type and scale of savings potential from adopting the minimum energy performance standards that you will hear about in the model regulations, you can see the very, very significant electricity savings, emissions reductions, and very importantly, energy bill savings. This is shifting billions of dollars from the lower economic productivity sectors of energy generation to consumers' wallets, where they can spend this money in other economically beneficial ways. The equivalent of cars removed, and then the last column is the number of equivalent power plants that would be avoided with putting in place these minimum energy performance standard scenario. Next slide, please. And one of the great aspects of the model regulations is, in addition to minimum standards, they also have a high efficiency and middle tier to help countries also see a trajectory of improvement for efficiency. Efficiency does not stand still. Innovation is constantly occurring, and we want to encourage through complementary programs, for example, adoption of these more efficient technologies to bring these products to market. And you can just see the increase in scale of savings with the high ambition scenario. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Brian.
Great, thank you so much, Gabby. So what I'd like to dive into again is a bit of how we got here. Why did we develop these model regulation guidelines in the first place? And where I'd like to start is that we had the honor and the privilege to co-host training workshops with essentially all of the world's developing and emerging economies over a 2-year period. In 2018 and again in 2019, we held what we called a twinning workshop, a series of twinning workshops in different regions around the world. And these brought together senior energy efficiency officials and ozone officers, people that work in environment ministries typically, and they are charged with compliance with the Montreal Protocol. So for folks that aren't aware, and just as a bit more of background, part of what we're trying to do here is bring together two different topics that are typically not addressed jointly. So energy efficiency is a big opportunity from a climate standpoint, economic development standpoint, and a lot of the energy ministry officials are familiar with setting energy policies and having energy programs. On the other hand, in the environment ministry, they're dealing with the refrigerant gases that are in air conditioners and refrigerators, and they are often working on these things without having the support or the engagement of energy officials. So this isn't the case everywhere, but in many cases, we met with officials from over 120 countries and talked with them about their day in and day out jobs. How is it when they go home in terms of having interagency collaboration on setting policies? And in many cases, for the first time, these officials from the same city working on very similar issues for air conditioners or refrigerators had never even met before. And so the twinning workshop the first year around was getting at the basics of what is energy efficiency, what is the refrigerant gas transition, and why do these two critical topics need to be brought together? Why do the ministries need to work together? And so as we talked about these topics, a few different key takeaways were coming out region after region. And it was clear that many countries are already taking some sort of action on trying to gather more data in their markets, but in most cases, they don't have a good grasp of what's being sold in their countries. Data is a big issue. And without good data, they couldn't make informed decisions when it comes to policies. There's a number of countries that have some sort of data collection scheme. They're picking up aggregate levels of refrigerant gases as they come in through the ports, but they don't know what that means in terms of end use equipment. What's included in a typical refrigerator or air conditioner? Again, the challenges varied, but some of the key themes were that data is lacking by and large. Many countries are interested in minimum energy performance standards and product labeling. Maybe they have some on the books and they're out of date. Maybe they're looking to set them for the first time. But there was a major call by country after country on trying to understand where are global markets headed in terms of technologies, where are the major markets setting their policies in the future, and how can countries align on their policies. So I'd say by the end of 2018, by the end of 2019, once we went into more detail, there was a real interest and commitment region after region where officials were saying they wanted to not only work across ministries, but also work across borders. How could they get common minimum energy performance standards, energy labels for ACs and refrigerators to be commonplace as opposed to very rare as it is today. So our initiative at UN Environment, United for Efficiency, has undertaken the development of some tools to help out in addressing these core questions and concerns that have been raised by countries from around the world. The focus of today, of course, is on the top one, model regulation guidelines. So what Alex and Neehoff will present here in a little bit are the contents of the model regulation guidelines. What do we suggest countries adopt if they're looking to regulate refrigerating appliances or air conditioners? As well as a separate document, a supporting information document that helps tell the story that underpins why we selected what we did in the model regulation guidelines. And as you will see, it includes not only minimum energy performance standards, but suggestions on energy labeling, and also, and this is quite unique, to simultaneously address refrigerant gases. The refrigerant GWP limits that we'll talk about here are something that you don't typically see. Governments will often just set minimum energy performance standards, labeling requirements, but it won't simultaneously address this issue. So we're trying to make it easier for officials. When we spoke with them in all these different countries, they were telling us time and again they would like guidance on how to bring efficiency and refrigerant transition together, and we think this is a great way to go about it. U4E, our initiative, has produced these for, of course, the two topics today, refrigerating appliances and ACs. But if you're interested in regulating lighting, electric motors, or distribution transformers, we also have these available on our website, which has the URL listed at the bottom here. Gabby provided an overview at the beginning of the call on the global impacts of adopting the minimum energy performance standards or the high ambition scenario from our model regulations. That's an aggregation of individual assessments that we've done for 156 countries. So for example, I know we have a great cohort listening in from Ghana at the Energy Commission. There's a number of officials together there today. And we have an individualized country savings assessment for Ghana. We've got it for Kenya, and the list goes on for 156 countries. These are custom tailored country by country to show you the impacts in terms of electricity savings, greenhouse gas mitigation potential, utility bill reduction potential, and so on. So it really captures in a succinct way the potential impact if your country were to pursue the model regulation guidelines. And to the extent that we had data on the country and its current policies, we took that into account. So if you have current model regulation guidelines, we would indicate the impacts if you were to ramp up the efficiency requirements and refrigerant requirements according to the model regulation guidelines. So I would encourage you to look at your country's country savings assessment on our website. Last but not least, product registration systems. Countries want a good way to track what's being sold in their market. I gave the example of Ghana earlier. They have a system of this sort where they're tracking what's being sold in their country. Are the products being imported allowed to be sold in the first place? This sort of market monitoring and then verifying that performance and enforcing the rules is essential. So just setting the model regulation guidelines alone will not do anything. Products have to be monitored and tested, and rules have to be enforced, or else the model regulation guidelines won't make an impact. So these are tools to get you started, whether you have policies already or if you're getting started for the first time. These are meant to help you along that process. This just depicts in a little bit more detail a country savings assessment example. Again, these are all available on our website. The URL at the bottom that gives the very specific address where you can find each of these. You can just click on the map and then look at that analysis. And this is really good if you're trying to make a pitch to a senior official on why does this matter? Why should we consider setting efficiency requirements for these products? And how does that stack up in terms of an opportunity relative to, say, investing in more generating capacity? If you're under grid constraints, you're having power outages, or you're having to really ramp up the amount of power plants needed to meet growing demand, you can check out the impacts of what efficiency can gain for your country. And if you have questions or feedback on the analysis that we've done, you can reach out to us and let us know. So now let's dive in. For those who don't have much of a background, this may be familiar from attendees of the twinning workshops, but this is a very simple overview of minimum energy performance standards. Let's say in a typical market, if it's unregulated, they have no market monitoring system, there are a variety of refrigerating appliances available for sale in that market today. And it's clear that some are going to be worse performing. They have worse energy efficiency than other models, but it's often tough for consumers to differentiate. And they might not know that buying a really inefficient product is going to cost them a lot of money on their utility bills. So one of the targets that we're trying to make easier is to be able to set a performance floor, a minimum energy performance standard that would ban the importation of used products. It would also ban inefficient products from entering the market. And if you choose to do so, if you want to also regulate the refrigerant gases simultaneously, it would also ban high global warming potential refrigerants. For consumers to further understand, though, the differences between products, the performance of those products, it's important to have labeling. This is a generic example. You can use stars, letters. There are various approaches to labeling, but this is just a simplified example to show that oftentimes governments will try to incentivize the very best products, those A-level products or top star products that enter into the market. In this case, we've got a little green leaf next to the best product, and the consumer can get a better sense of what's available for sale. So in a nutshell, this is MEPS and labeling. And we're drawing in the model regulation guidelines from some of the world's best examples. We didn't just sit, 3 or 4 of us in a room and try to draft these things. We did a mapping and got a good sense of where are the policies at today around the world. We have a spreadsheet that tracks all of the policies that we're aware of on refrigerating appliances and air conditioners. And we wanted to see where major markets are headed. Where's the technology trending toward? And so this is just one example among many. We selected this one from the United States because it has some of the world's longest running MEPS and energy labels. And just to describe this in a little bit of detail, you've got the time frame down below running from the year 1960 all the way through 2020. On the left y-axis, there are a couple of pieces of information depicted. Energy consumption, which is the blue line that you'll see trending on the chart. And then the retail price of refrigerating appliances in the United States market depicted in green. And these are in 2009 dollars, so it's compensates for inflation. On the right side, y-axis, is the adjusted volume of refrigerating appliances in the United States market. And that's the sort of orangish or reddish line that's depicted on the chart. And what's rather amazing is if you look at the blue line, that energy consumption keeps going up as refrigerating appliances get larger from the early 1960s until the early to mid 1970s. And when the state of California, one of the biggest markets for these products in the United States, signals to industry that it's going to start to regulate the energy efficiency of these products, you see a major drop in the energy consumed by refrigerating appliances. And what you can also note is that the refrigerator volume, the size of the product, gets larger while the energy consumption is dropping. And because California and eventually the United States as a whole, regulated by the federal government, was tracking data on these products, they continued to enhance the stringency for the energy efficiency requirements. And over time, you see that blue bar continue to drop. There are subsequent standards that are driving this drop and enforcement measures occurring. Refrigerators are getting larger, and the price of products is declining. So the net story here is something on the order of a 75% drop in terms of energy use from its peak, or maybe a little bit more than that. Similar story on the price to purchase one of these products. Refrigerators are larger, and the cost to own them is much lower because they're wasting a lot less energy. And so it's this type of story that's driven many, many markets around the world to set minimum energy performance standards and labels. And if you look at this, this picture of the world, this is our database as up to date as we have it. If you've got additional information, please send it to us. We can update this further. But what it depicts are countries that have mandatory minimum energy performance standards and labels for air conditioners in dark green. If they're voluntary, it's in light green color. If there are new ones under development, it's in dark blue. And if we either don't have data or if there are no AC, MEPS, and labels policies, then it's in gray. So if you just looked at this, you'd say, well, most of the world's already moving in this direction. Why do you need model regulation guidelines? And what's important to point out is that many countries have policies on the books that are either out of date, they've been set 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and with the speed at which the technology evolves, performance improves, prices are dropping, those policies are now well out of date. Many are unenforced or underenforced, or there's circumvention going on. So a country might say, well, we're banning the importation of used products, and yet they're finding over and over that used products are flooding into the marketplace. So enforcement's a challenge. Another big issue is that you can have neighboring countries that have completely different policies. And so they're asking a manufacturer to do one type of test, the neighboring markets requesting a different type of test, and the cost of compliance is driven up. So it may spur some manufacturers to not want to comply in the first place. And for those that do play by the rules, it's driving up their costs, which they're going to pass on to consumers. So we're hopeful that the model regulation guidelines can help you set policies that are up to date, that if you have strength in numbers, if you have neighboring countries working together using a common set of rules, they can also share data and help to jointly enforce the rules that are set. So this should theoretically make it easier for everyone. And there's a reason why, for example, the European Union does this across country after country. They have a common set of rules and requirements and share the burden when it comes to enforcement. The same story could be told on refrigerating appliances. I won't repeat myself. It's essentially the same story. This just gives you a simplified overview of the status of policies. So the aims of the model regulation guidelines, we really hope that these will make it a lot easier for countries that want to either adopt new or enhance existing MEPS and energy labels. We're encouraging countries to simultaneously address energy efficiency while transitioning to lower global warming potential refrigerants. You're obligated to do this as it is under the Kigali Amendment, and it makes a lot more sense to address both of these opportunities simultaneously. You can see some of the other benefits here. What we're hoping to do is drive more robust policies that are demanding greater energy efficiency, that are using more coherent and consistent requirements for labeling. We've, of course, got variations here. Not every country is the same. Weather conditions, climatic conditions vary, and so the performance requirements need to vary accordingly. So where possible, we tried to streamline this and offer a consistent set of clear guidance, but we have differentiations on some of the core areas where it may be needed. In terms of benefits, we've talked about this a bit already. We really think this can help drive innovation in markets where they've been lagging in terms of getting better performing products. Many cases, countries that have unregulated markets or outdated policies are dumping grounds for products that can't be sold in well-regulated economies. So one of the things that we're hoping to do is to drive innovation in developing and emerging economies in terms of the products that are offered for sale, to make them more affordable because they're tapping into economies of scale, the types of products that are being sold in bulk in countries that have robust MEPS and labels. And we're trying to make it a lot easier to harmonize requirements, reduce barriers to trade, enable countries to better work together on monitoring and enforcing the rules. So just to point out, if you go on our website, I had the URL up earlier, and we'll have it at the end of the presentation. On the website, if you were to click on, say, the air conditioners model regulations, you can download the guidelines. They're currently in English and Spanish, and we're doing additional translations. And you can also download the supporting documentation. So I'd encourage you to look at both of those to get the full picture of why we developed what we did. Just a word on how we came up with the contents. At UN Environment, the United for Efficiency team worked to secure the funding resources from the KSEP team and from the JEF. And we've really been championing this work over the past year. It was October 2018 through September of 2019 that we developed the contents. And it was up to our team to make final decisions, to weigh the feedback we got from the many different reviewers, and to land on the final sets of documents that are available on our website. And currently we're working on the translations, as I mentioned, into various languages. I need to thank once again the team at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and Natural Resources Defense Council. They were lead authors on these documents, selected by our team at UN Environment to review global best practices, develop the methodology that underpins the analysis and conduct that analysis, and really do a lot of the heavy drafting on the text and refinement of it. And this is part of the outreach today, this webinar where they've joined us. And we've got a very large cohort of experts from around the world that weighed in to develop this content. So again, this is not some small group effort. We had officials from around the world, from regional organizations, civil society, various businesses, and so forth, so that we could benefit from diverse opinions to get to the best possible content. This is just a quick snapshot from one of the opening pages of the model regulation guidelines. You can see this in the document. It acknowledges the many reviewers that we had involved. We had over 60 experts from around the world, some of whom are with us on the call here today. So thank you so much for their contributions. This should give you strong confidence in what's been developed when you consider the expertise that's been brought to bear to develop the model regulation guidelines. Okay, in terms of outreach, we had a big announcement at the Climate Action Summit hosted by the UN Secretary General in New York. Many heads of state were there, CEOs, influential people, to talk about this very topic: why address cooling and how can you go about it? In October, we got started on the translations. This month of November, we've been very busy in Rome and China. Just had a workshop last week in Peru for Latin America and Caribbean countries. My colleague Patrick will be in Kenya next week for an East African community workshop that's being conducted on this topic. And today, of course, is the webinar. Importantly for all of you, I've got it underlined here: in December is when we're really looking to get underway in terms of technical assistance on adoption. So if you like what you see, you've got additional questions, you can pose them here today. We'll get through as many as we can, but we'll also have our email addresses, and you can follow up with us in terms of any additional questions that you have. How can you adapt these for use in your market, for example? And then we'll have some additional sessions going on and events in 2020 as we continue to ramp up the outreach efforts. And just a few last slides to close out here on my side before turning it over to Nihar and Alex on the contents. We are not looking at the model regulation guidelines as a one-size-fits-all solution. It doesn't, for example, get heavily into the issue of the how-to steps of implementation and enforcement. It's really listing what could be adopted into legislation or as a regulation in terms of performance requirements and other aspects. But if you're wondering, how do you do an impact analysis in your country? How do you enforce the rules or monitor the market? Those are separate topics that we wanted to deal with in other types of documents. And what I've got depicted here on the bottom of the screen are 4 examples on what we had developed for lighting with support from the government of Australia. And we're going to be doing similar types of supporting complementary guidance for air conditioners and refrigerators that we aim to release in the next 6 months or so. And just to say in terms of outreach, there's been a lot of attention on this topic of cooling, a lot of interest because it has such profound impacts on the climate, on the economic well-being for countries. And we've been trying to raise awareness through a new platform called the Cool Coalition. And I'd encourage you to go to that website, see a bit about the bigger picture beyond just refrigerating appliances and ACs, on all of the actions happening around the world to accelerate the adoption of sustainable cooling solutions. So with that, that's enough from my end. I'm going to be turning it over now to Dr. Neehoff from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and to Alex Hilbrand from the Natural Resources Defense Council, and they're going to go ahead and step us through the model regulation guidelines content. Alex and Neehoff, it's over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me? This is Alex Hilbrand from the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Yeah, it's coming in clearly. Thanks.
Wonderful. So Brian, thank you and Gabby for laying out some of the ways that this document hopefully will be helpful in supporting regulators in a variety of different locations working to update or set MEPs on refrigerators and air conditioners. It's been very exciting for NRDC to be a part of this team, and we've worked on these topics, energy efficiency and the Montreal Protocol, for about 50 years now. Next slide, please. I'd like to go through what the scope of this document, rather what it contains, and a bit about what it does not contain and why. We think that as we have Brian laid out the scope of the task ahead at setting and maintaining MEPs, and there is a lot to do with it, but there were a couple items that very clearly would benefit, any regulator would benefit from some common language, some harmonization with other policies globally, and some common language, you know, across the ozone office and the energy efficiency office. So we focused on those key areas as we developed this document. The first is scope and definitions, exemptions of the products that would be covered by these model regulation guidelines. The second are test methods. These are a great place to harmonize, which facilitates a lot of the cooperative testing and enforcement that Brian mentioned, and of course we'll get into more deeply. Energy efficiency performance requirements, or actual MEPS performance levels. This is one of the most exciting parts of this document, is for the first time it lets a regulator see in the performance suggestions what performance level in that local country would be able to tap into where the biggest economies in the world are going in terms of regulations. So that kind of translation is really powerful. The next is performance labels. These would be the performance levels that exceed the recommended minimum, so the 2-star or 3-star levels of performance above the minimum. And finally, requirements on the refrigerants and foam blowing agents used in these products, their impacts on ozone and climate change. A number of items are not directly addressed in this document. Brian mentioned some of them. That includes how to develop and maintain a product registry, how to certify laboratories and procedures used by laboratories and enforcement, and monitoring, verification, and enforcement procedures. Those are more specific to a country context and its reality on the ground, so it's a little bit less critical that it be harmonized, but we do hope that harmonization of some of the above will greatly facilitate the work that needs to get done. Next slide, please. So a brief word on scope. We identified the product classes that are growing most quickly across the world and that have the greatest potential to have their impacts lessened by requirements on energy efficiency and refrigerants and foam blowing agents. This doesn't include everything, but it includes many direct cooling systems and refrigerating appliances. So this model regulation guideline would pertain to non-ducted single split air conditioners, self-contained air conditioners, portable and reversible heat pumps. And we're making sure to bring in a number of products here to avoid creating loopholes or anything like that. But this does not include things like building chillers. On the refrigerating appliance side, this really would pertain to refrigerators, freezers, and combination units. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Alex. So this is Dr. Neehoff from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and thanks also to Brian and Gabby for the introduction and overview about these model regulations. As Alex said, it's been very exciting for us to be part of this team, and we really hope that these model regulations will be very widely used. As part of this endeavor, one of the things that we wanted to ensure was that we use the test procedures and metrics that are the most widely available and used by many different economies in order to ensure the most amount of harmonization. And so as you see on this slide, for refrigerators, we use the IEC 62552 standard, which was adopted in 2015. And for air conditioners, we use the test standard of ISO 5151 and the metric ISO 16358 standard, which specifies the cooling season performance factor and APF performance factor, as you see in the last row of the slide. The point again being that we wanted most economies to be able to feel assured that we were using the best knowledge available and to ensure harmonization across many different economies. We also ensured that these standards would be able to be adapted for different climate zones, and you'll see more detail on that in the next slide. Oh, sorry. Actually, further down the line. But in this slide, I'm sorry, go to the next slide, yeah. So the minimum energy performance requirements that we looked at also, we tried to ensure both for fridges and air conditioners that the levels that we considered would be applicable to, again, most economies, that we would ensure that air conditioners and refrigerators would be available at costs that could be affordable for the majority of consumers. In order to do that, we looked at many different markets. So as you see on the left, we looked at, for example, the US, India, and the EU in comparison to the model regulation requirements. And as you see on the right for air conditioners, we looked at Mexico, China, and India for air conditioners, in addition to a number of other economies. And essentially, we tried to make sure that we were setting the regulations at a level either that these major economies were already at, or at a level that these major economies were heading toward, to ensure that we were banning the least efficient products, and also, as mentioned earlier, and Gabby mentioned, I believe this. So there are also stretch tiers for labels. So in order to ensure that not only are we able to set minimum standards right now, but also able to set levels to ensure ambition for product labels or for other types of programs, such as incentive programs. So, for example, the line in the group 1 level that you see, we also have stretch tiers for labels that are available for setting these higher levels. Next slide. So in addition to being able to set minimum standards and labels, we also wanted to ensure that the same air conditioner or the same fridge would be labeled according to the climate zone or the weather that would be experienced in that particular country. And so as you see on the left, we have different levels, and we also have different temperature bins on the right for the different air conditioner climate zones. And so again, we try to ensure that these regulations would be applicable as widely as possible. And so these different groups that you see, group 1, 0A, 1A, those are all referring to the ASHRAE climate zones. And the high efficiency levels represent approximately 30 to 60% of the efficiency improvement that's possible. But it's less than the efficiency level of the best available technology. In other words, the best available there's still room for further improvement even beyond the top level of the label, but we wanted to ensure that these levels are widely applicable. Next slide.
Thank you, Nihar. So we also, in the model regulation guidelines, have put forth several refrigerant and foam blowing agent requirements. For getting into the numerical values, it's important to state that the applicable standards put forth or regulations put forth should indicate compliance, require compliance of products sold with relevant refrigerant designation and safety requirement standards. Those include ISO 817 for refrigerant designation and ISO 5149 for safety or some others. So we are providing some figures of where major markets are going for refrigerants and foam blowing agents, both related to their ozone depletion potential, or ODP, and global warming potential, GWP, the latter over a 100-year time horizon. For refrigerators, the ODP should be 0 and the GWP should be 20 or less. This reflects the widespread global adoption of alternatives to CFCs and HFCs that have very low GWP. For air conditioners, the ODP should also be 0, and the GWP for split systems should be less than 750, and for self-contained systems, that should be less than 150. Next slide, please.
And Alex, maybe I'll just add a point of additional context here. What you're seeing here is a simplified extraction from the documents. So, for example, you would see in the opening of the document, we've got a forward there, and it explains the context on, of course, the fact that every country is different. Countries need to conduct impact analyses and understand where is their market at, what is best suited to their market. So the findings that we have here are really based on our best sense of where markets are at, where they're headed, and what is truly viable at this point, by and large. Of course, every country is different. We have a footnote, for example, on this section indicating we do think in many markets it makes sense to set such GWP refrigerant limits around, because this would come into effect in a couple of years in most cases. If countries started, say, tomorrow in a theoretical time frame, it would take some years before that actually gets adopted and implemented. And if we look out to, say, 2023 and consider the refrigerant gas transition that's happening, it's going to make sense in many, many countries. Already today, and we'll have some statistics on this coming up in a little bit, but already today, around 3/4 of the world's refrigerating appliances are using very low global warming potential R600A. And so just to say that on each of these, you're getting a simplified sense. Once you get into the documents, you'll get a much clearer sense. And we indicate, of course, some regions use different types of test procedures, different types of approaches. But really what we're trying to drive at here is wherever you can find commonality across countries, be ambitious, pursue these types of levels, because this is what we're seeing come into place in various markets around the world. And in a few years from now, the technology should be there at price points that are viable for at least your close consideration. So anyways, just wanted to throw that in there, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And we certainly do recognize that refrigerants and foam blowing agents, both of these points are subject to Montreal Protocol controls that have either been fully ratified by countries or are in the process of being ratified. And so, as Brian says, there certainly will need to be a local assessment of, the viability of these and exactly when, but it's clear that there are major market penetrations of these products that would comply with these levels that we'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. So we also are suggesting in the document that some product information, some important product information be made clear for the consumer and for those acting on behalf of the regulator to assess what the energy performance and refrigerant related performance of products sold are. So they're similar for refrigerators and air conditioners, but I will go through them quickly, through for the air conditioners. So that should include model name, serial number, what type of unit it is, because the requirements may differ, country where the product was manufactured, the rated cooling and heating capacity, the maximum rated power consumption, the rated performance grade, so that is to say, is it a 1-star, 2, or 3, or however that is formulated in the model, in the regulation that implements, and rated energy efficiency level, the specific performance level, yearly electricity consumption in kilowatt hour, and again, the refrigerant designation and certified safety standard. That should include ODP and GWP. We think it's important for these products to bear these on labeling, again, to facilitate checking for compliance. Next slide, please.
So as I mentioned earlier, we try to look at many different markets to ensure the availability and the cost of these appliances would not be prohibitive for most of the economies. So as you see on this slide, for air conditioners, we looked at many different markets, including China, India, Indonesia, and Brazil, as well as the Caribbean, to see where the markets are today. One point to note is that since we expect these regulations to be adopted in a couple of years from now, as Brian mentioned, these models are likely to be replaced by models that are even more efficient, and therefore these circles that you see here are going to be headed further upward, so above the model regulation line. So you'll see more models on the market over time that meet these model regulation guidelines. But as you see here, we're ensuring that on most of these major markets, already there are many air conditioners and as you'll see on further slides, many refrigerators that are available that meet the model regulation guides already. Next slide. So here you see the top level of the air conditioner model regulations, and as you see the thick blue line, and again, even for the top level, we try to ensure that there are air conditioners available, and in the next slides you'll see refrigerators available that today meet the best available meet the model regulation guidelines. But we also try to ensure that these are not too low, so there is some relationship, in other words, between the regulation, the tier 1 levels, and the best available technology in any particular market. And so when you see this acronym BAT, that refers to the best available technology on that particular market. And as you see here, the best available technologies are about 30% higher than the model regulation levels on those markets. Next slide. For fridges, you have to look at it somewhat in reverse, in the sense that models below the lines are the ones that are allowed on the market. And so if you see here you're seeing, for example, the red line refers to India's 2017 requirements, and you'll see the model regulation essentially both the minimum level and the high level. There are some models that already meet the requirements of the model regulations. And as you see on the right, even for the high level, the model regulation levels are set at a level where you have refrigerators that are available on the Indian market, and we think globally as well, that meet those levels. So we try to ensure that we're harmonizing where the major markets are going in order to ensure that countries will be able to avail of the economies of scale from those markets, because as more appliances are made in India and China and other places, of course, the prices of these appliances fall. And so we try to ensure that those benefits are captured and available for the major economies.
Neehoff, if I can just add to that briefly, one of the
Yes,
things we've been trying to do at United for Efficiency, we work with about 40 countries around the world on market transformation projects. And if a country were only to look at a market assessment of its local economy, and let's say they hadn't met some labels or they're pretty out of date, they may look at what's included in the model regulation guidelines and be worried that they don't have products today that could meet these levels. So what we're trying to point out is the vast scale, the number of these products that are already being sold in other markets that have more strict regulations. And what we're encouraging is try to tap into those economies of scale, as Neehoff and Alex have been talking about. So if your market assessment today doesn't indicate that these are there, you might want to talk with some of the leading vendors in your countries and ask them, could you source these products that we see are being sold in huge quantities in India or in other markets? We've got a lot of this information in the supporting information document that will give you a better sense, and then it can allow for a more wide-ranging discussion as you do impact analyses in your markets than if you only look at what's currently being sold in your market today.
Next slide. So this slide shows the high efficiency level again for refrigerators, and again, models below the line already meet the U4E level. And as you can see, again, in the large markets in India and the EU, as well as to some degree in China, there are refrigerators that already meet the level of the high efficiency tier. So countries can feel assured that if you set your high efficiency level, your let's say 5-star or A level of your label at that level, that you have appliances that meet that in the larger markets. And so you can ask manufacturers to supply those models in your particular country. Next slide.
There is also growing availability of these appliances using lower global warming potential alternatives. For air conditioning units, about 84 million units using R32, which has a GWP of about 677, have been sold as of this past spring. We also know that Godrej in India has sold at least 600,000 R290 air conditioners with very low GWP in India and South Asia. Refrigerators have long since transitioned in much of the world to using R600A, as Brian mentioned, also very low GWP, and the flammability issues with it have been fully addressed. So we are encouraged by these figures, even with split air conditioning, while something with GWP 677 may not be the final alternative selected in a market. It's much better than R22, HFC, R410A, which are essentially the default alternatives under consideration, and the large market for these products should facilitate not easy, but easier availability of compliant products. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to say a word about compliance with these regulations. So ultimately, of course, it falls to a government to check for compliance with these model regulations as promulgated and to do market surveillance to make sure that manufacturers are complying. The requirement ultimately will fall on the manufacturers for selling non-compliant models, with enforcement action possible against those manufacturers if there's a problem. This is to say that a consumer, if he or she buys a non-compliant model, is not breaking the law. It would be the manufacturer. There's a more detailed discussion of this and several of these topics in the U4E policy guide for air conditioners and fridges, and that was from 2017. The team also recommends using conformity assessment reports as a mechanism for manufacturers and importers to convey to regulators that their products comply. These should be time limited to ensure that, to reduce the risk that products change after compliance or anything of that nature. And we also recommend that, countries continue to look at what their energy efficiency requirements are and their refrigerant requirements are, and update them periodically as available products on the market change. Next slide, please. So a brief conclusion, and then I think we hope to get to questions and answers. So first of all, Gabby painted the picture of some growing urgency for electricity grids and climate and environment to put MEPs and performance labels requirements on fast-growing cooling appliances. This is a goal I think all of us share. And the potential is there to address both refrigerants and energy efficiency at the same time. So we hope that these documents serve as a focal point, a focus around which different regulators, different countries can come together and begin that process, or begin the process of revising what has been in place in their countries. There are a wide array of compliant products available worldwide, and now these documents make it easier to see that in the language of a local regulatory body using its local climate conditions, etc. So at the end of the day, I think we all hope that harmonizing around some version of these standards will allow us to increase our ambition in energy performance and refrigerant performance while lowering overall costs of compliance by, again, tapping into the economies of scale that we are seeing emerge. So the U4E model regs make it easy. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Alex and Nihar. So that takes us through the content. I've got quite a few questions that have come in. We're going to go through question and answers, but I just wanted to switch to this slide so that you can see our contact information as well as the website where these materials are available. One of the questions that came in was in regards to the availability of these materials, the webinar itself. This is being recorded, so we will have this posted, a link to it posted on the U4E website. I'll also be circulating the presentation itself, the slides, so that you have these available once we conclude. So if you have colleagues that didn't have a chance to participate, encourage them to listen to the webinar, look at the slides, and of course, review the model regulation guidelines that are on the website and the supporting information document. And from that, you can reach out to me, Brian Holly at un.org. Let me know what questions or comments you have. We're not going to be making further changes to the model regulations, but if you're interested in how to adapt this for use in your country, please let me know. So with that, let me relay some of these questions to the speakers. One of them that we've received is in regards to the slide, I think it was slide 35, on the availability of air conditioners with R290. The slide indicates that there are 600,000 R290 units that have been sold in the Indian market. And the question is whether those are self-contained units or split system ACs. Neehoff, I think that question goes to you if you have that information.
I don't have the split between the self-contained or split, but I believe that they are the smaller size, so less than 1.5 ton mostly, and include both split as well as self-contained systems.
And this is Alex. It's my understanding that the majority, and I'm tempted to say vast majority of these are split systems. Certainly there are quite a array of split units up to about 1.5 tons, as Neehoff says, on the market from Godrej in India using R290.
Thank you both. And I know from some of their other work more broadly, there's a partnership with GIZ where Godrej R290 split system ACs are being introduced into the market in Grenada. A lot of interest by fellow Caribbean countries. There are similar projects like that underway to prove out the technology, show the technology for people that aren't as familiar, might have safety or other questions. And as far as I've been seeing, there's been quite a bit of interest and uptick. So it's not just an India story. That's where it's, I'd say, taken hold the most, and that's where you see the really big numbers. But you're starting to see this technology in various parts of the world taking hold.
Yeah, I believe there's a demonstration project in Indonesia as well on R290.
Thank you. Another question that we've received is in regards to the label. So this is something, Alex, that you were speaking to earlier. Will the year of manufacture be required, or is it suggested that countries require that on the product label?
Yes, thanks, Brian. We should have included in the slide year of manufacture. That's of course necessary to assess whether or not the product was made before or after the applicable standard was put into force. Mostly we see that manufacturer's serial numbers include model year as part of the coded serial number. So if not model year, perhaps at least the information of how to translate for the regulator from a serial number into a model year. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question we've received is in regard to the methodology for conversion from Chinese minimum energy performance standards to cooling seasonal performance factor. So will we be able to share that methodology for conversion?
So while we won't be able to share the overall methodology, I think you can get a pretty good idea from the associated materials that we're putting up, the supporting documents. And also, just to say a word or two about that, essentially what we did was we took the ASHRAE weather data from I think a few thousand weather stations around the world, and we came up with the ASHRAE climate zones and temperature bins that can be used with the ISO 16358 standard to essentially adapt the model regulation level for those climate zones. So the same air conditioner would have perhaps a different numeric value associated with a different climate zone, but that the requirements would be largely similar across the world. That's the short version.
Thank you, Neehoff. Had another question that just came in on our experiences of how to deal with market lobbies that oppose ratcheting up the use of minimum energy performance standards, and how is this dealt with? Maybe one perspective I would offer just globally, what we did here on the model regulation guidelines is make sure that there is a diversity of opinion at the table. If your government's being approached by, say, just one company, especially on these products where there are so many manufacturers out there, never good to listen to just one voice. A lot of what we tried to do was talk to many different competitors. They had the same opportunity to provide input, to provide data. nobody was given a particular pride of place to drive this forward, and the same would apply in the country context. In many cases, you're going to be dealing with entrenched interests. Let's say that there's an industry for importing used products, and officials realize that this is to the detriment for the people of the country. It may save them a little bit of money when they buy the product, but it's awful when it comes to their energy bills, safety considerations, the impact on the electricity grid. And so a lot of what needs to be done is a robust communications campaign nationally, through the schools, through industry associations, talking to businesses, consumers, retail sales staff, to communicate why do these rules need to come into place? Why do they need to be enforced? How does somebody comply? There is no silver bullet or easy answer to this, and I know that especially the first time countries try to get the regulatory process underway and start to do enforcement, it can be very difficult. There's oftentimes a need to have support across various ministries. You might need police if they're going to take a product off a shelf and test it, and there's concerns that the inspector is coming by. Perhaps they need support from other agencies. So it can range from, of course, lobbying, but it can also get much more difficult where some subsets of the market are trying to work around the rules. And it also gets to the point that if neighboring countries can align on these same levels, enforcement's going to become easier. Many borders are porous, but if you can have neighboring countries in lockstep with your government, it's going to make it a bit easier. And I think pointing to the model regulation guidelines, the global transition that's underway is going to have impacts for your country one way or another. You can either be proactive and be part of that transition that's happening, and if you're a laggard and if a lobbying group is effective in killing any regulatory action from happening, it means you're going to be a dumping ground for really bad products that can't be sold elsewhere, really inefficient products. So I think a lot of this is about selling the benefits of this transition and making sure various groups are part of the process, have a chance to be heard. And then once they've all been given their due opportunity, the best decision is made on behalf of the country. Gabby, Alex, Neehoff, I don't know if you guys want to weigh in on that issue, though, of lobbying by certain market segments.
I'd like to add one particular set of stakeholders that was very useful in this conversation to hear their viewpoint is folks that are dealing with the electricity system. In particular, for air conditioners, it ends up being a very large peak load in many countries, and to the extent that the electricity utility or the electricity utility regulators that are having to deal with the consequences of the peak loads are able to speak to that. We found that particularly useful in some of these discussions.
Thank you.
And this is Gabby. I would just encourage folks to reach out, especially if they're part of, for example, the networks, regional training networks, to colleagues who have dealt with similar issues. I know, for example, there's a lot of experience in South Africa and Ghana and India and a number of countries, and looking at and working with industry and other groups to get the information necessary to pass effective standards.
And we've got quite a few additional. Oh, please go ahead.
No, we can move on. I just would urge folks to consider, that having the benefits of the regulations as, facilitated by the country assessments that UN Environment has done, plus even some other, a look at air quality improvements and other, co-benefits of these regulations could be very powerful. And that's an emerging area of work specifically related to cooling efficiency that's worth checking out. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you very much. And we've had quite a few additional questions just come in. So we'll go maybe rather quickly through these. On slide 29, GWP minimum was 750 and 150. What informed the determination of these targets?
I'll take a stab. This is Alex. So we worked with the 100 or so reviewers and among the project team to look at what performance levels or what GWP levels are most widely available that also represent significant, gains versus the status quo. And for split systems, we saw more than 80 million units with a GWP less than 750 have been sold worldwide. And again, while that may not be the solution for forever, probably it won't be, that type of availability we had comfort with when recommending in this document, which ultimately we hope to be used across the world, that products could be found by the time that these regulations become effective that would comply with that performance level. Again, Godrej 290 units are there, but the market share is about 1% of those, so that's what informed the split system level. For the self-contained systems, it's much easier to incorporate mildly flammable refrigerants into them. They're much more widely available with flammable refrigerants that fall below GWP 150. So we also had comfort with that recommendation.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, there's a question from Ghana, which is currently using EER, energy efficiency ratio. Going forward, how can they compare CSPF and SEER, seasonal energy efficiency ratio?
So I'm not exactly sure which SEER you folks are planning to use, but the ISO system that the model regulations is based off of can essentially be tailored to the temperature bin that either suggested in the climate zones shown in the model regulations, or if any country prefers, you can also adopt your own temperature bins, and some countries have, for example, done that. So like India, I believe in 2016, adopted a temperature bin that they found was applicable for them. And so that would be one way to do it. The EER and CSPF are not directly comparable to each other because the EER is a full load metric, while the CER or the CSPF are part load metrics. So that would be my short answer. And obviously, we can have a longer consultation or conversation if there's interest on this topic.
Okay, and that brings up a good question we've got here related to that. Concretely, what kind of support is available going forward? So for now, what we are equipped to do at United for Efficiency is to respond to technical inquiries. If you have questions, for example, if you've done market impact analysis in your country and you're wondering how to do some sort of conversion, if you want some more information, you can send those to me, Brian Holly, at un.org, and we can get back to you to the best of our ability with a response. We have projects in a number of countries: Senegal, Ghana, Rwanda, 5 countries in the Caribbean, and well beyond that, where we have multi-year, in-depth collaborative efforts underway in partnership with the governments. In those cases, we're equipped to provide quite a bit more support in an ongoing basis. If we don't currently have a multi-year project with you, we're always open to exploring opportunities to develop one and pursue a project. A lot of our aim, in addition to the national level engagement where we have projects or remotely answering inquiries, is to convene multiple countries at regional settings, especially if they're already going to have a regional meeting, say of energy officials or ozone officers. We can tack on to those meetings and have a special session on this topic where we can get into more details that are particular for that region, because ultimately we hope to see groups of neighboring countries pursuing these and not just individual countries acting alone. So if you have more questions about that, please email me once we conclude. Okay, a few other questions here on, can the frost-free factor be applied to the fresh food compartment, which has frost-free technology? Neehoff, I won't attempt that one, so I better better ask you to weigh in.
So my understanding is that it could, but I'm not sure why one would want to regulate one compartment separately. So we may need to come back to this with a little more input from my colleague Wan Young Park as well. So let's table this for one that we can follow up on.
Thank you. Okay, and bear with me. I've got many questions that have arrived, so I'm just trying to scroll through these and not do any that are duplicative. Okay, is there a plan to expand this approach in the future to ducted products, multi-split VRFs, etc.? Currently, our aim was to target the biggest market segments, the biggest near-term opportunity that we saw in the end-use equipment arena. So that's how we settled on the refrigerating appliances and the air conditioners that are covered under the scope of these products. So we're going to have a major effort underway to try to deploy these and support countries in adopting them. And over time, I'd say probably in 5 months, 6 months down the road, I think we'll start to explore what interest there is from countries, what kind of demand are we receiving for additional areas of support. So we do cover with the model regulation guidelines the main end uses of electricity around the world for refrigerators, air conditioners, lighting, motors, and distribution transformers. But we will consider expanding that based on interest, and we'll have to secure additional resources to be able to pursue additional complementary model regulation guidelines. Okay, here's a question regarding the use of fans. If fans are commonplace in countries, how should that be taken into account in terms of trying to decrease the load that has to be dealt with by air conditioners? And I think we can frame this maybe not in an individual application, individual building, but if governments, for instance, are looking at cooling in a holistic way, they're going to think about the various ways to cool a space. And Alex, Neehoff, I don't know if you guys can weigh in on your understanding of the status of, say, regulating fans and the implications of that relative to countries considering pursuing air conditioner MEPs and labels.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In general, I think obviously to the degree that fans are available and adopted in any particular country, the air conditioner loads tend to be lower. And I believe one way to handle this would be to change the default set points. However, we didn't, in the U4E model regulation, we wanted these to be available as a standalone document. And so we haven't so far incorporated the use of fans in the model regulation itself. Having said that, if there's particular consultation that anyone is interested in terms of how one might consider these two things together, we can certainly think about how one might do that and work with you folks to maybe recommend a set point change or a default set point that can be adopted along with the model regulations if a fan is being used alongside it. Separately from that, of course, fans themselves can be subject to regulation in terms of energy efficiency, and we've done some work historically on that as well. And that can also be a future topic that we might explore further.
Thank you, Neehoff. And perhaps related to that, there's a question on urban heat islands and hotspots in countries. And so if a government's going to set national minimum energy performance standards and labeling requirements, are there things that government should be taking into account when you consider urban hotspots?
This is Alex. I would say this is a great point, and there's some thinking to be done about how to do this precisely. I think we've, among us, we believe that national standards on these cooling products are the right level of jurisdiction, the right level of government to do that. But hotspots are clearly a problem. We've seen action at the city level to start mitigating that, and that's through things like deployment of cool roofs and planting of trees and other approaches like that. So I think that, there's a question to be asked, is this a city level initiative, whereas the MEPs are national, or is there a way to do some of these other things at a national level? But I'd also like to hear, I know Gabby and KSEP have been thinking about this question quite a bit. Thanks.
I'd also like to add, there can also be, installation guidance, for example, where we ensure that, for example, the outdoor units are not stacked one on top of the other, so the hot air from one unit is going to the other unit and adding to the inefficiency, perhaps, and adding to the hotspot. So there can be something that can be done, to ensure, for example, that the outdoor unit is installed in a shady space and so on, that would potentially be useful. But those typically end up being guidance from manufacturers to, and in terms of best practices, those are also, I think, referred to a little bit in the U4E model regulation, in the U4E policy guides as well. So those are a couple of places to look for resources on that.
Great, thank you. And Gabby, I've got a question maybe I'll direct towards you on assistance to manufacturers. If they're looking to enhance their manufacturing practices to offer more efficient products, is there any assistance that can be provided to them? And I'm wondering if maybe you could say a word about the MLF support that's provided there, support from KSEP or any others that you might be familiar with.
Thanks, Brian. So there is, as you mentioned, as part of the transition, there is the sectoral approach used by the Montreal Protocol and Multilateral Fund to assist conversions in enterprises that are majority A5 owned. Those transitions, conversions have focused on the refrigerant component. There are some pilots with HFC transition that KSEP has co-funded to support the simultaneous redesign for improved efficiency. Those are some pilots that are undergoing right now, and hopefully will be useful in informing parties. But that, in terms of new sources of funding, these are things that are underway now. As there is additional interest in this area, there is additional work being done to identify other sources of finance that I would say are at both multinational but also subnational and public and private sectors. So this is, I think, an area where enterprises have their own sources of seeking finance, especially if they're going to be making products more competitive for efficiency. But there's definitely work and additional interest in this sector. So keep your eyes peeled for developments there.
Great, thank you, Gabby. A couple questions on country savings assessments. The power plants, the number of power plants that don't have to be built as a result of adopting and enforcing the model regulation guidelines, that varies by each country's context. If it's a small island developing state, for instance, the typical power plant there might be, say, 25 megawatts. And what would be considered a large or larger size power plant in a mid-size economy with high electrification rates, perhaps it's 500 megawatts. And so we've got a variation. You'll see this defined in each country savings assessment by country on how we came up with that and what the assumptions are. There's also a separate methodology document if people have additional questions on the country savings assessment. Okay. Question here about greening the grid. Are there variations for countries in that regard if a grid is transitioning to higher penetration rates of renewables? What are the impacts or considerations for countries that are looking at the model regulation guidelines? I don't know who wants to take that one on. If nobody, I can follow up.
I can offer some initial thoughts, and then maybe you can go ahead. So essentially, as the grid gets greener, obviously the emission savings are lower, but of course, you would save money. You would continue to save money, and you would continue to also perhaps use or make more electricity available. So the benefits are different in nature, but you would still accrue benefits from more efficient refrigerators and air conditioners. So I would offer that as a initial thought on that.
Okay. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving on, but just to say one of the benefits that we were trying to point out is on peak load issues for countries that, you know, if you're using PV and you're getting a lot of the added power onto the grid thanks to solar panels when it's sunniest part of the day, it's also around that same time frame where you get a lot of heavy air conditioner use. And unlike refrigerating appliances, which, you know, generally cycle on and off in a relatively smooth pattern on an ongoing basis, ACs run most when it's hottest. And so what that means in terms of being able to take off dirty fossil fuel, heavily polluting, very expensive peak power plants is enormous in terms of what it can yield for infrastructure investment savings for governments, for utility bill savings for consumers. Okay, and maybe we'll close with one last question. It looks like a more technical question in regards to somebody who's been meeting with Japanese air conditioning and refrigeration lab, wondering about a combination of T1 and T3 IEC specific performance measurement formula. Is something like that possible? So hopefully that makes sense, Neehoff or Alex.
Yeah, so usually in any economy tends to either have a requirement for testing at T1, ISO T1 or T3, usually not both. So I think we probably, again, need more consultation to check if actually, I believe this is Pakistan, is planning to have testing at both T1 and T3, in which case we might need to have a combination formula. But typically, if it's just one, then the way that, for example, India did it or some of the other countries are doing it would be to have a weighted average that covers a wider span of temperature, as is possible with ISO 16358 without requiring more temperature test points. That might be a way that satisfies without adding more test points. So again, we can take this offline and see if we can answer this more fully.
Thank you. And one closing question here. I've got another one that's come in. What will the coefficients for A and B be with a reference temperature of 28 degrees Celsius? I don't know if that's something you can do on the fly, Neehoff or Alex.
I don't want to do it on the fly because I'm afraid of getting it wrong. So.
Okay, very good. And we're just past time. We're about 6 minutes past. But these are the sorts of questions that can come in, and our team can take a look at them and get back to you. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had a good turnout here today, but this is just one of many, many outreach events that we're doing. Perhaps we'll be in your region for an upcoming event. Reach out to us. And the big point here is that these don't sit on a shelf or on a website. We're working with a number of countries that have already expressed interest in pursuing these model regulation guidelines. So if you're not one of those, we hope you will be soon. Please reach out to us. And thank you so much for your time and attention. We'll follow up over email with the link to the webinar recording and the materials, and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one. And thanks so much to the presenters, Neehoff, Alex, and Gabby. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all.
Thank you.